would be a lot easier and a lot better. But it's really an impressive group of folks who really are thinking in a very meaningful way about U.S.-China relations. I mean, Russell's going to ask me, I'm always an optimist. Everybody always knows I'm always the optimist. The question is the narrative less bleak than the media presents it? And I think you can say it is. Craig made reference to the fact that we seem to have been through the acute phase of this crisis. And I think that's right. And we have to think back to just a few weeks ago when it was leaked from the speaker's office that, she was going to go back to Taiwan. And the conversation was so dark. The conversation was really, would the speaker's plane be diverted by the PLA Air Force? Would she be allowed to land? Would she be allowed to take off? It was really dark. And the fact that we are now through this crisis, the crisis management mechanism between the United States and China during this period has really worked pretty well. That, I was afraid 4 or 5 weeks ago that we might have people who were killed. We might have the equivalent of the EP3 crisis from 20 years ago, where a U.S. reconnaissance plane was run into by a Chinese PLA Air Force fighter, and the pilot was killed. The plane was forced to land in Hainan. But we seem to have got through it. Now this assumes, and President Biden shares this view, that China will not escalate further. And if China basically understands, it has reinforced its red line, the world and the United States understand that this was a red line, and then moves on. It is heartening to see that the business community and business between the United States and China continues. And there have not been threats against U.S. companies. Bear in mind, that is not always the case. When the Koreans, when the Philippines crossed what the Chinese said was a red line, they had their imports from China, from Korea and the Philippines blocked. You had pop singers from Korea who couldn't perform in China. A whole series of things. We are not seeing that now. And that shows that there is a understanding in the senior levels of the Chinese government that continuing business while we are having this diplomatic and political crisis is a good thing. And I think that and it's not being generally reported by the media. The media is painting a much darker picture. Yes, there were huge risks, but business has continued, investment has continued, trade has continued.
Exactly.
This was supposed to be a question and answer, not me giving a lecture.
Yeah. Question. Steve and I. Thank you. Keep me sharp. Steve and I met up in Steve's office several weeks ago, and at that time, I wrote a story and I put out a headline that said that business was better than headlines. So that rule is still true even after.
Yeah, I think business is better than the headlines. If you were to basically read what media, the general media was reporting, you would think business is falling off a cliff. There is, and I think the China General Chamber's poll on sentiment, where there is some decrease in Chinese companies wanting to remain in the United States. That, to me, by the way, is disheartening. And we've seen some decrease in the chambers, the U.S. chambers in China, companies' sentiment towards China. because ultimately, it's the businesses still are the foundation of the relationship. The people-to-people relationships that are created by business are what is going to protect the U.S.-China relationship over the long term. Trade is important, but investment is like marriage. When you invest, you don't pick up and leave if you have a problem tomorrow morning. You are married to that investment, and you work to make it work. I've always believed, I started working on investments in China in 1980, just when the joint venture foreign investment law was passed, and I started working on those investments. What I came to understand is the business people are the ambassadors to China. And when China started investing in the United States, you folks who were from China and investing in the United States, you were the ambassadors for China's culture and history and values, just as Americans who invest are ambassadors. And if that starts to erode, if what we talked about today, the restrictions on investment continue to grow, that could be deeply damaging to the people-to-people relationships between the United States and China, which is one of the important foundations for the U.S.-China relationship. So when Craig is right, when he quotes Adam Smith, that defense is prevailing, but we need to measure the costs of those restrictions. What so often is happening is there's no measurement, there's no consideration of the costs. I've spent the last couple of days speaking with our Department of Justice about some of the cases that are brought against Chinese in the United States, or researchers, or students. Well, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands, and there are a handful of cases. So the question becomes, when we put out the word that you're going to be prosecuted, we need to be careful that we measure it against the benefits that these hundreds of thousands of students and researchers and business people bring to the United States. So, not advocating don't do it, but I'm advocating that we have a strong cost-benefit analysis.
Steve, how are you at the National Committee involved in the people-to-people side of the equation, and what kind of suggestions would you have for businesses here to advance that?
Well, as Ken said, the zero COVID policy, so the 7+3 is still in effect. It's better than the 21, but it's still in effect. I'm a strong advocate of China importing enormous amount of mRNA vaccines, inoculate high-risk people in China, and then open up. That science tells us that it is possible to inoculate and then open up, and I hope over time that China does that. People to people, Craig just told me he's going to go to China, so that's great news. I'm still reluctant with the 7+3, but I will go at some point this year. The reductions in people-to-people exchanges has been one of the causes of deterioration in the U.S.-China relationship. When you are not seeing people face-to-face, you're much more willing to demonize them. So once we can recreate these people-to-people relationships, once Chinese, you see it on the streets of New York. There are fewer Chinese on the streets of New York because tourists are not coming, because they're unwilling to come to the United States when they know that when they go back, they're going to have to quarantine for a significant period of time. So that would be a very important move to either get rid of entirely or follow now the Hong Kong rule, which is 3 days of quarantine and then 4 days of limited activity, which would allow for many, many more people. I mean, we're beginning to see, there's some folks from Beijing and Shanghai here today, we're beginning to see some folks starting to come back, and that's going to be very productive. The committee itself, because our delegations are often, congressmen and senior, senior business folks and others, they don't have the time to go and spend effectively 10 days in quarantine in China. So until that gets lifted, those kinds of delegations are going to be restricted. And it's so important today for the senior leadership of China to speak directly to the U.S. Congress, to speak directly to members who are willing to go to China. But to the extent the quarantine remains in effect, that is going to be difficult to do. Obviously, we are Zooming constantly. When I leave here, I will go and do a Zoom with people in Beijing, as I do virtually every single night. But that it's better than nothing, but it is not as good as being there in person.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great time.